Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul. How are you this morning?
Doing well. Thank you.
Good.
Back at it, trying to make the world a better place to live in. And I don't know who's measuring things, but right now, I don't know what kind of grade we get.
I think we're in the minority.
Yeah, but if you look at it, that plant seed, that's how I can rationalize, nothing happened. How many bills did I get passed in the Congress? Well, maybe I planted a seed here or there. So maybe we're planting seeds, and that tends to have ideas grow, and ideas, are powerful. So we're going to deal with ideas once again today, sort of on the war, even a little bit about what's going on with COVID and the leader of the COVID movement and the one that wants to destroy medicine. I think his name is Fauci or something like that. We'll mention him. But we want to talk about this terrible, terrible mess in Europe and how we can go from a few years ago with the excitement of the end of the Cold War with a lot of improvements. In spite of the shortcomings, there were a lot of improvements. But behind the scenes, there was still a lot of activity. The Western faction, the NATO people, were still building their empire. At the same time, Russia was trying to survive, and we were all delighted to know that the Soviet empire collapsed, and it collapsed on its own accord because it didn't work very well, and they had economic problems. But right now, there's a lot of activity going, and how there's been incidences that you'd think people could and had been upset, but the whole thing is, and we mention this so often, and that is what happened in 2014. There was a coup. Well, there are a lot of coups. The United States was involved. Nobody knows it, but that was a coup, and that's happened before. We were involved with coups back in Vietnam and a lot of other places like that, and ended up badly. So right now we have a faction going on, and there's a hot war going on. People are dying, and there's three factions going on. I see. It's the NATO forces in the United States, which are the militant group, and then you have the Russians, who aren't bashful, are trying to defend what they think is their territory. So it goes on. But then maybe the real battle is neutralizing the obsession and the power of the media, whether it's social media or regular media, and that may be the biggest job we have, because what people are believing comes from those two sources. Our numbers are growing, and people do want to hear about it, but the propagandas are very, very powerful, but that's been known, I guess, for a long time throughout history. But right now, there are three factions involved, and it looks like things could really deteriorate and get much worse, because we kind of have a clip on, Senator Coons, who said, well, things aren't going so well, but we got to save Western civilization. We got to protect the First Amendment. We got to save our Constitution. So how do we do this? Well, the Russians haven't gone home yet, so we better send American troops. American troops on the ground? Well, they've been in the air for a long time. No matter what goes on, we're in the air, and this process is accelerating. If we do, and it sounds like we will, and we already have special forces every place that we think that we should be, so it goes on. But this is an open suggestion by a senator with clout that we better start thinking about it. This is the way it works to start conditioning the people. I wish it would excite the people who don't like the draft and they don't like, our militaristic foreign policy, that it would wake them up now and not wait for an ending like, it hasn't ended in the Middle East. A few people died over that, and that lasted 19, 20 years, and it was certainly a long-lasting war in Vietnam. before it was decided, well, 60,000 Americans killed, maybe we ought to think about something else. And even then, people saying, you chicken-hearted liberals, Americans, you won't want to fight. The liberals didn't want to fight. They were more progressive, so they keep on. And there's still people in Washington that say, that was a big mistake. We left Vietnam too early. So this is a bad step. I sure hope they have second thoughts.
Yeah, you mentioned conditioning the people, and I think that's a perfect terminology. Let's put up this first clip. This is the article via antiwar.com. This is Newsweek. Coons says Putin will only stop when we stop him when pressed on U.S. troops. And this is a familiar old pattern that's emerging. We've seen it over and over, Dr. Paul. If we don't stop Saddam in Baghdad, he's going to be in New York City taking over. If we don't stop Gaddafi, he's going to take over Africa. It's the same old neocon line that's used over and over to put people into a frenzy. If we don't stop Putin now, we're going to be speaking Russian next week. And unfortunately, the people don't recognize these patterns. It seems to work every time. It's like Charlie Brown with the football that Lucy's holding it. She always lets it go, and he always tries, and he always kicks it and falls backward. Everyone always thinks that we're horrible, unpatriotic people until in the end it turns out our way. But this is preset in motion. And actually, let's put the clip up. Let's just hear what he actually has to say. He's on the Sunday talk shows. Very powerful. He has Biden's old seat in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Coons says, we're in a very dangerous moment where it's important that on a bipartisan and measured way, we in Congress and the administration come to a common position about when we are willing to go the next step and to send not just arms, but troops to the aid in defense of Ukraine. If the answer is never, then we're inviting another level of escalation and brutality. So let's break down what he says, Dr. Paul. He's literally saying, if we don't engage Russia with American troops over its current border dispute with Ukraine, that somehow Putin is going to expand through Europe. There's a new Soviet Union that's going to emerge, new Cold War, which of course the military would love to see happen, and we're all going to be attacked. It's again over and over the same pattern. There's no evidence. You know what it is? It's the same old domino theory. Because you mentioned Vietnam. If we don't go into Indochina and if we don't bomb in Indochina, we're all going to turn commies. Well, we did go in and bomb Indochina, and we're turning into commies anyway, as you point out every day on the show. So it's an old rhetoric that he's using, but unfortunately, it tends to work.
I always added, what happened in Vietnam? They became more westernized when we gave up on the bombs. But the one thing that is really bothersome, it tells you a little bit about the character of the people we're contesting this with, and that is they don't admit they're ever wrong. They're always right.
Yeah.
And there's an excuse. But they have to, deep down in their heart, and if there's a brain, they have to realize that they have been wrong and they've made a serious mistake. But it's impossible psychologically for them to accept this. So therefore, they have to, deny it. They have to deny that it even exists. And the one thing that they have been able to manage with themselves is they never have any shame. They could do a policy where millions of people do die sometimes over these policies, and how many people died in the Middle East. But there's never anything. Maybe we did something wrong. Maybe we shouldn't have gone in. Maybe we should have been more cautious. Maybe we should have declared the war. Then we could have had an ending to this, and on and on. But they never have any sense of guilt. They have no shame, and that means that they're immune from reason and morality, and then they turn around and they're magicians. All of a sudden, they know something about propaganda, and then what they do is they take all this and they put all the blame on the people who have been trying to fight it, because the whole thing is, if you oppose some of these foreign policy, now he's this is treasonous. And I
Yeah.
believe I probably have been accused of that too
Couple
a
times,
couple
yeah.
of times. That treason is because you don't go along with the status quo, and the status quo, unfortunately, right now is still militaristic. That is such a source of so many problems we have.
Well, remember Condoleezza Rice, we can't wait around until we have the evidence. We can't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud. Over and over they have this hyped up rhetoric, and it's bipartisan, as Coons himself said, unfortunately, and this is where my biggest beef is with the Republicans for going along with this. Let's look at, this is not a good example of a Republican, but trust me, they're mostly on board. Here's Kinzinger, that great disgraced Republican. Yep, it's time to understand that Ukraine must win, and negotiation is not in the cards at the moment. That's easy for him to say, right? He's not getting bombed out of his place. Then he goes on, our generations are getting the lessons that our grandparents understood. The only way to defeat evil is to destroy it. This is so Marvel Comics, this whole thing.
The only way to save the village is to destroy the village.
Exactly,
This is the bigger village right
Exactly.
now, and it looks like Ukraine's going to be destroyed one way or another, and it won't be saved. Basically, because they don't accept some very fundamental facts about how people should treat each other and how they should live. Which have been known for a long time. Tyranny and force and violence and wars have been known for a long time. But the other side's been known for a long time too. From the beginning of history, people recognized what "thou shalt not kill" meant.
Yeah.
And that's not like 100 years or so ago they discovered that those were good rules. They've been there for thousands of years. So the contest has been there, and there are a lot of ups and downs, but there's so much suffering. And I guess the thing that's so sad is the correction is so easy to understand, and it's so beneficial. Why isn't that the pragmatic argument doesn't carry any weight? I think you should have moral, and you should have financial arguments and all this. But the practical argument is something maybe they'd appeal to. Maybe it's more practical to live in peace with, rather than having our governments going off and stirring up more wars somewhere around the world.
There are a lot of Republicans, not enough, but there are a little handful that have been refusing to vote in favor of these, as you know this pattern, increasingly militaristic, increasingly hostile measures in the Congress, moving us closer to war. They refuse to do it because they're cowards, the ones that are voting for this. The ones that have courage are people like Congressman Massey. He's been called Putin's congressman because he's trying to keep us out of a war that has nothing to do with our national interest. But most of them, as you know, Dr. Paul, are cowards. They want to go up there and crow like a bunch of roosters and act like they're such hotshots. But when it comes down to actually defending the American national interest, they could not care less. Let's look at Michael Tracy's really quick, because Michael is also always very good, and he's just reiterating what we're saying. But put this next tweet up. Senator Chris Coons, the Biden conduit who holds his former seat in Delaware, has actively begun floating the deployment of U.S. troops to Ukraine. Putin will only stop when we, the U.S., stop him, he warns. There he goes. So people should be very clear about this. Americans should be very clear about this. We've talked about this before, Dr. Paul. Where is the peace movement? Where is the anti-war movement? If Americans go along with what both parties in Congress, in the majority in Congress of both parties are doing, we will be in World War III. And this is not little Condi Rice going on about Iraq. This is Russia. We're going to be fighting a war that may end up destroying civilization over the borders of Ukraine.
Yeah, sad story, and we can keep at it, because I don't know of anything else you can do to try to persuade people, because it seems like it goes on too long. I just couldn't imagine, and was imagining it constantly in the 60s, because I was sort of involved in getting through and had to wear a uniform and that sort of thing. But it took a long, long time, and so many people died. And then it was this total failure, on a part. And they still say they say that, you know, that's the policy that we have to use. And if you don't do it, you're some type of anti-patriot, anti-American,
Yeah.
if you even suggest that you can live in peace. But, you know, that we, you know, heard from the founders when they talk philosophically about what we should be doing. The one that is the most appropriate right now is stay out of entangling alliances.
Yeah.
Can you think anything more entangled and ridiculous and really deceitful is NATO?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, NATO, you know, it's a grand success if they can find a country that only has 500 people and they say, oh, you can join us. Oh, we have another country. Because they'll come and help us if we ever get into military problems. Yeah, sure, they're going to help us. It never was the case. As long as we have, as long as we're the financial power, we will throw our weight around. But it's a terrible thing to look for the real answer, because the real answer comes. All empires end. And I think that's what's going on in this world today is people are recognizing that, and people do know that the foreign policy is getting pretty sloppy, and the monetary policy is pretty sloppy. The dollar is pretty sloppy too. So all those potential changes are coming. But the one thing, you know, the conditions, with the conditions we have, you can predict what probably will happen. You don't know when it's going to happen. And the other thing is, unless people on our side are more active in providing an alternative, so even though you can't win with guns, if they self-destruct, at least we would have a chance to participating in what we will replace it with.
You know, I was on the phone with our good friend Jeff Dice this morning. We were talking about the situation, and if we sound a little desperate, I think it's, at least in my case, feeling a little desperate. And he pointed out, you know, when the Iraq War was starting, you know, we were reduced because of the real lack of social media being up to the level. We were reduced to writing letters to the Washington Post, you know, and then all of a sudden, social media really emerged after the Iraq War started, and we felt empowered now. We can fight back against the mainstream media dominating the narrative because we have our own tools. And now, and he made this point, he says now when you look around the landscape, the social media landscape, it actually feels worse than it did in the Iraq War, because if you dare challenge any aspect of the dominant narrative, you simply, with the click of the switch, you're canceled, you're gone.
The other thing that I think developed, which is equally dangerous, if not more so, and that is the development of the social media along with the ordinary capitalists, you know, in this country. All of a sudden, they became, you know, partners in this thing. So you have the people who are the giants of free enterprise and sound money and all this, and they carry out all the dirty work for these people that, you know, control the social media and the scenario, and they have that, and the people fall into it. I mean, I don't cry when I hear that a few people left Facebook, because in a way it was built on total deceit. You know, the money was a big deal, and that's okay. But if somebody was getting a service, you know, from it, and communications were great, and some of it was really healthy. You know, talking to your friends you went to school with, and families came together again. But it was all a gimmick to suck you in and become obedient to, you know, the lockdown. You know, and they had you.
Yeah. Well, our next story, if we can put it up, if you can get that next one up, we'll just do a short one on this. But this is important because this is the same thing, but it's about escalation. British Special Forces are training local troops in Ukraine. This is from the Times of London. Serving UK soldiers, a NATO member, are on the ground as such, participating in the war at this time, officially on the ground and in their military capacity. The response to Russia has been, we do consider these troops on the ground training the Ukrainian soldiers to be legitimate military targets, which any country would do. But this really shows a huge escalation on the part of the UK, which has been, aside from Poland, the most hawkish in Europe on this.
Yep, they're there, and people are sucked into sometimes training or a limited amount of troops, use sanctions and starve them out of their own money and all these things. And even the progressive gets sucked into this because they say, oh, that means I'm against marching with troops in there. But that is acts of war, and even some people would say it's a stretch for me to say that when you put in sanctions and you prohibit imports, that's blocking trade. And we wouldn't put up with it. Yet that constantly happens, and they do this in the name of feeling better with themselves. Yeah, I vote for sanctions, and I vote for all these controls, and I vote for closing down their economy, punish the kids. Then we put on sanctions in countries, and almost every day I can find an article where they say, "Well, we're getting ready to put sanctions or have put sanctions." Guess who's some of the victims? The American people. What was it? It was something we were putting sanctions on, and it was going to backfire. It was going to hurt the American consumer more than the country there we were putting the sanctions on. So it's used. It's a propaganda tool, but that's a basic a misunderstanding of economics, because people, when they go to our colleges now, they don't get anything that Lew Rockwell might have taught them from the Mises Institute. You have to search for that.
Well, Boris Johnson is going to get his elite troops killed in Ukraine over a borders dispute with Russia, and the British population is a lot like ours. I think they're, by and large, they like war. Maybe they have memories of their empire. There is a good, healthy minority that feels the way we do. But, there already have been foreign mercenaries killed in Ukraine, plenty of them. There are rumors that there are at least dozens trapped in Mariupol, including potentially high-ranking NATO officers that are there in a bunker. 2 British mercenaries have been captured over the past week. I've seen both of them interviewed. So this is continuing to escalate. Well, Russia sent a letter to the U.S. a couple of days ago warning them, stop sending military equipment to Ukraine. And of course, it was promptly ignored by the U.S., which announced that it was ramping it up. And that reminds me of the letter that the Russians sent in December, if you remember. They said, look, we need to sit down and talk about a new security architecture in Europe before things get out of hand, before war breaks out, so everyone can be assured of safety and security. And what did the U.S. do? They promptly ignored it, they laughed it off the table, and they had a war start not long after that. It doesn't excuse, tanks rolling over a border, but if you can sit down and talk and try to listen to what the other group is saying beforehand and avoid the destruction of a country, I see no reason why you shouldn't try.
Do you know that one argument that is getting a little bit of reception in this country, more so before, and it's in a way a bit ironic, and that is, why are you over there? And they've accepted it blindly, and they say, you've spent these, not billions, trillions of dollars on all this activity, but why can't you deal with our southern border? We know there's some bad people coming in. Well, that's okay. We'll train them. If we give them automatic citizenship and a hotel room, they all of a sudden will become good Americans. So that's the whole story down there that just isn't going to hold water, I'll tell you.
And an EBT card, so don't forget, they get free stuff from the rest of us. Well, let's move on to more familiar domestic territory. Let's put on this next clip. Here's a face we haven't seen in a little while, and he makes an amazing admission. This is Dr. Fauci. He's back in the news. Thanks to our friend Steve Watson over at Summit News. There's a video where he says, and this is one of this, I guess we categorize this, Dr. Paul, as inadvertently telling the truth. He said, you use lockdowns to get people vaccinated. This is what he declared on MSNBC.
But that's immoral.
Well, he doesn't think so.
he thinks if you don't do it, you're stupid, right?
Yeah.
Besides, how's he going to make a living? That poor guy is just barely getting by. He'll be getting food stamps pretty soon. But that is sad. And he said that he was approached. I'm going to quote from that one little story we had. Is a strict law, a strict test lockdown, you'd never be able to implement in the United States. Although that prevents the spread of infection. This is about Fauci.
Yeah.
I remember early on they were saying, and I think accurately, that they were doing better than anyone else, that as long as you take the vaccine. But this is, I wonder when our first time on one of our programs that we mentioned that there was self-interest by the pharmaceutical companies. Of course, a lot of our supporters talked about pharmaceutical companies a long time before this whole epidemic was even mentioned, because they were suspicious of it, and it has been going on for a long time. And I think the whole thing is the Flexner report. I believe that was the beginning of the fight between holistic medicine and allopathic medicine, at least the prohibition and the penalties that suffered from the holistic approach. And it's still that way. And back then it was to solidify organized medicine and selling drugs, and that was minor compared to what goes on today. Yeah. So it's big bucks. And in medicine, anytime a question would be asked in medical school about, what about this holistic thing? Boy, you get frowned on, and that might have been a few years ago.
They're kooks.
So, yeah, what are they thinking about?
But it is an amazing admission when you think about it, because Fauci basically is admitting that lockdowns as such are worthless. They're only good because they force people to get vaccines. And that's amazing. And that quote you read is fascinating, because that's him praising the Chinese approach. And we've seen over the past week, and I'm not a big China basher, but I've been repulsed and disgusted by the policies they've had in Shanghai and elsewhere, where you literally cannot exit your apartment. People are jumping out the windows in despair. The most repressive policies of any regime, maybe except for Canada and Australia. But in all seriousness, here's what Fauci said about this horrible, horrible Chinese policy. I remember early on they were saying, I think accurately, that they were doing better than anyone else. And that's what the zero COVID lockdown extreme policy.
Yeah, that is the case. But the people, are sort of bullheaded on this stuff, and they are going to listen to it. I've had some discussions with people that were friends and reasonable conversations and all, and they just would get down, and it was almost hard to admit, but it was this loyalty to authority.
Yeah.
I got to go. If the government's in charge and they're doing their best, they have access to all the information. So therefore, I will follow their rules. And yet, it wasn't because it was right. It was because the government had conditioned him to accept it. And you don't want to be challenged, because that probably is one of the social pressures that has been effective. A lot of people, very hesitant about, your job and going to school and being in athletics and all these things that people suffer from. So it's a real tragedy. And when the dust settles and this gets written, but they're already appearing, the articles to show that none of it was doing any good. They've given the proof that social distancing wasn't worth anything. The vaccine isn't going to be proven to. Oh yes, I know. All these people that are getting it, and they say, yeah, but it would have been much worse. I might have died if I hadn't had the shot. I just got sick for a month.
Yeah. Well, we're going to finish out a little bit more on the media, because it's a similar topic, but this is something we saw over the weekend, and a lot of people have seen it. It really made its way around, and I'm going to actually show the clip, the video clip. But this is, they call it, the Zero Hedge brought this up. Very, very good job they did. MSNBC blast from the past. And ironically, they're talking about Elon Musk back then, and it's 2017, and they're criticizing the fact that he wants a role in the media. Let's listen to what Mika and Joe have to say about Musk back then.
Who were Trump voters and are still Trump supporters, they go, yeah, you guys are going crazy. He's doing, what are you so surprised about? He's doing exactly what he said he's going to do.
Well, and I think that the dangerous, edges here are that he's trying to undermine the media, trying to make up his own facts, And it could be that while unemployment and the economy worsens, he could have undermined the messaging so much that he can actually control exactly what people think. And that is our job.
Yeah, if you look at the issues, Yamiche is right. He's doing exactly what he said. It's
right.
It's
He's trying to control what people think, and that's our job. That's what they say. It's pretty amazing to hear.
You know, but they take this message and understanding of what they're guilty of.
Yeah.
It's constant because they can flip that around. It seems like that's the best training you can get in politics is know how to take anything you've done wrong, just twist it around. I can't think of anybody that has been more expert on this than the far left and the Democrats have done, you know, with the Republicans. And I'm not a partisan, but I just think that because it's starting to come out. You know, there's more news just recently, you know, of the lies and proof of what's been said for a long time, but they don't even report it when the truth comes out. You know, so it's a sad story as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I'm going to close out and just reminding our viewers, put on that next clip if you can, the final clip. Here's our June 4th conference. We're going to start announcing some speakers that are going to be there. Of course, Dr. Paul is going to be there. I'm going to do my part there. Houston, June 4th. Tickets are reasonable, Dr. Paul, $55. There's going to be a great breakfast, full breakfast available, buffet. So a nice several-hour-long conference. The Biden Doctrine, New World Order or Nuclear Armageddon. I mean, this is literally unfolding in front of us. We're going to grab the bull by the horns and talk about it in June. The good news is that we've sold, last time I checked, well over 60 to 70% of our tickets. There aren't a ton of tickets left, and we haven't announced anyone, to be fair. So I would just tell the viewers, if you are interested, go to ronpaulinstitute.org on the upper right-hand side. You're going to see a place you can link. Check it out. See if it's something that interests you. We always have a good time, Dr. Paul. That's your number one rule. We always have a good time. I know I always learn something from the speakers. I learn a lot from the speakers, and I greatly appreciate them. So it's going to be a great time.
Yeah, very good. And I'm glad you reminded everybody about my rule because that's what I was just thinking. You know, come and have some fun and enjoy the atmosphere and the other people that agree with us on these issues. And that is pretty important. It doesn't mean you don't talk to other people, but you don't. My rule is you don't argue with other people who are closed-minded. There's no purpose in that. And this is so important that there's an atmosphere that has to be developed to promote the philosophy of voluntarism. That's another word I like. You know, just think of if everything that we could think of in economics and social order and personal order and religious order, if everything is voluntary, boy, you know, it really is very tolerant. People get along, and you don't force people and yell and scream or put them in prison or do all these terrible things to people who disagree. But, you know, there was an old statement that we should be more like what we were taught in some of the parables. And one parable is, if you're not guilty, you that are not guilty should be thrown the first stone. And believe me, I keep thinking about that in foreign policy and everything else. And people are so anxious to throw the first stone. And that is why, this was one thing that Leonard Read, who I admired and ran the Foundation for Economic Education, he said that he says it's the way you approach people that make a difference where they might listen. And his one thing was, you know, if you know something and you're respected, they'll come to you and ask you questions, which I thought every once in a while I got somebody like that. But one day I was in some controversy on the House floor. I can't imagine what it was. And and then I wrote it in a newsletter. I said that, you know, I don't want to push it. I want to wait and wait until they ask me something. And one of my libertarian economists, hardcore, wrote me a note. He says, tell them anyway. Don't wait for them to ask. Just tell them anyway. Maybe we do a little bit of that here, but we want to encourage people, because I found the discovery of liberty and economics and social liberty and religious liberty all just coming together. And I said, that's not very complicated. I have an MD degree, but I don't think I need a PhD to understand how people could come together. The rules are short and simple, and anybody who wants to follow them, they know how to do it. Matter of fact, instinctively, most people know what is right and wrong. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.